Imagine standing in the knee-deep yellowing grass of the demilitarized zone, staring through binoculars at a rusted metal marker half buried in the dirt. For decades, that marker, number 1292 to be exact, was the absolute line. It was the red line where the world ended and the enemy began. If a North Korean soldier stepped even an inch past it, the protocol was instant and ironclad. A megaphone warning, followed by the sharp crack of a warning shot. It was a landscape defined by total clarity and high stakes. But lately, something strange is happening on the South Korean side of the fence. In September, a quiet directive was filtered down to frontline commanders that didn't involve new hardware or troop surges. Instead, it was about the maps. The order was deceptively simple. If the South's modern military maps and the old 1953 UN reference lines don't match, the troops must now use whichever line sits further south. In an environment where every centimeter is historically soaked in blood, the South Korean military has effectively decided to let the border drift backward. The atmosphere at the outposts has shifted from hair-trigger readiness to a surreal kind of restraint. While North Korean soldiers are busy digging trenches and burying landmines just a few dozen meters away, sometimes clearly overstepping the old boundaries, the South's response has gone uncharacteristically quiet. In the 2 months following this change, North Korean incursions tripled. Yet the sound of South Korean warning shots has largely vanished. It looks like a calculated move to prevent an accidental spark from starting a fire. But to the veterans and officials watching from the sidelines, it feels like something else entirely. They see a military unilaterally surrendering its own soil without a single shot being fired. It raises a haunting question. In the world's most dangerous strip of land, does moving the finish line actually prevent a collision, or does it just invite the other side to keep running?
And that really is the question, isn't it? That's the core strategic dilemma we're going to get into in this deep dive. We're looking at something that feels very quiet, but has these profound implications. South Korea is unilaterally redefining the Military Demarcation Line, the MDL.
Right, and this isn't some big treaty negotiation.
Not at all. It's an internal policy shift, but it's huge. It's essentially trading, a bit of territorial integrity for what they hope is tactical de-escalation. And it's happening when tensions are, they're incredibly high.
Okay, let's unpack this right away because the details here are everything. This wasn't a public announcement. This was internal guidance, right, from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the JCS, sent down to the soldiers on the front line. What exactly did that instruction say back in September 2025?
So the guidance is very focused. It only applies where there's this ambiguity. The JCS directive tells frontline units that if they see a discrepancy between the MDL on their own modern South Korean military maps—
the ROK standard.
Right, the ROK standard. If that line doesn't match the reference line used by the United Nations Command, the UNC standard, they have to use the line that's farther south.
Farther south.
Whichever one is farther south. That's the new rule for determining if an incursion has actually happened.
So let me get this straight. If a South Korean soldier sees on his map that a North Korean unit just crossed over by, say, 20 meters, but the UNC line is actually 30 meters further south, the new order is to just ignore what his own map says and use the more conservative UNC line.
That's precisely the practical effect, yes. If North Korean forces cross the ROK line, but they haven't crossed the UNC line, the troops are ordered not to fire. So it effectively, cedes territory. It could be several dozen meters in some of these really critical but unclear spots.
And this wasn't an overnight thing. It was rolled out over time.
Exactly. The guidelines were first passed around in June of last year, but they were formally written into the Border Operation Manual in September 2025. That's when it became official policy.
And the official line, the stated goal, is to prevent confusion and, crucially, to lower the risk of an accidental firefight. I mean, on the surface, that sounds reasonable. But it's hard to see how a country can maintain its sovereignty by just moving its own finish line backward.
And that's where all the criticism is coming from. It's this perception of a unilateral concession. The critics, especially military veterans and the opposition parties, they see this as giving up ground on the Armistice line just to avoid a fight or to, keep the door open for dialogue.
And it builds on an even earlier change, right?
That's what makes it so concerning for them. This new map rule came after an earlier instruction that already told troops to hold their fire, even if North Koreans cross the MDL, unless it was absolutely necessary.
So you're layering a physical buffer zone on top of an already cautious firing policy.
You are. And the most controversial part is the change to the rules for warning shots. They're now only allowed when North Korean troops crossing the line are judged to have hostile intent. That is a massive shift from the old standard, which was just about a foot crossing a line.
But how on earth do you assess hostile intent from 100 meters away through binoculars?
You can't. Not really. That's the core operational dilemma that critics are pointing to. I mean, think about it. How is a junior officer, in a split second, supposed to know if that soldier is carrying a shovel to dig a trench or a rocket launcher? Are they laying communication wire or preparing an ambush?
You can't know until it's too late.
Exactly. You risk missing that critical window for deterrence. The goal is to stop things from spiraling, which is a genuine goal, but the effect, many argue, is that you're eroding the integrity of your frontline defense.
You know, it really brings to mind this story I heard about a young South Korean lieutenant. Let's call him Ji-hoon. He's at this remote guard post out in the DMZ. For months, his training was black and white. If a North Korean boot hits this specific coordinate on his map, it's high alert, period.
The old way. Clear rules.
Totally clear. Then September comes, and the orders change. He's told to look at this other line, this UNC reference line that's drawn further south, instead of the one his unit has been defending for decades.
So the ground beneath his feet hasn't changed, but the map has.
Right. And one afternoon, he's looking through his binoculars, and he sees a North Korean squad, clear as day, planting stakes past that old line. They're in what he has always been told is Republic of Korea territory. He's got his hand on the radio, just waiting for the command to do something.
But radio stays silent.
It stays silent. Because the new policy of tactical de-escalation now outweighs that old definition of sovereignty for that specific patch of land. I saw veterans online calling it a silent retreat.
That anecdote really gets to the heart of it. It brings the decision down to the individual soldier's burden. What we're really talking about here are the strategic implications of South Korea redefining these MDL boundaries. It's this constant tension between national sovereignty and de-escalation.
The tension that Lieutenant felt is the tension the entire command structure is feeling.
Absolutely. On one hand, you're trying to stop an accidental war. You want to make sure you're never the one who fires first, based on a shaky map coordinate. But on the other hand, by giving up that ground and adding this subjective hostile intent rule, you're losing the very clarity that prevents future problems. That silence from the South Korean side, it's a calculated risk.
A risk that the North Koreans might see as an invitation.
Precisely. And that's why this whole dilemma, this need to pick the southernmost line, is so fraught. It all stems from the fact that the maps don't match up in the first place. Which brings us to this massive cartographic conundrum. Why are there two different official lines?
Yeah, that's the technical core of the problem. You have to go back in history a bit. The MDL was set up by the Armistice Agreement in 1953. Originally, it was marked by 1,292 concrete posts. That was the physical line.
Physical markers, you could see them.
You could see them. But over decades of, erosion, floods, damage, only about 200 of those markers are even identifiable today. It's about 1/6 the total. So for more than 80% of the border, there's no physical line. It's just coordinates on a map.
It's all just coordinates.
Yeah.
And that's where the problem starts, because how you measure the Earth itself becomes the boundary. And you've got two different authoritative standards that are colliding.
Okay, so what's the first standard?
The first one is the ROK military map. This was updated around 2014, maybe 2015. It was based on data from the U.S. National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, the NGA, but that data was from all the way back in 2004. So it tried to match coordinates to the terrain as it was surveyed back then.
And the second, competing line, the UNC one that's usually further south.
That's the UNC reference line. It was created later, around 2016, and it used much more advanced scientific and surveying tech. When you change your surveying system over a distance like 248 kilometers, even tiny changes in method or new satellite data can shift a coordinate point by several dozen meters.
I'm trying to wrap my head around that. How does better technology lead to a disagreement of that scale? You'd think it would make things more precise.
It's precise, but it's precise to a different reference point. It often comes down to the underlying geodetic datum.
The data.
Yeah, it's the model of the Earth you're using for your measurements.
Right.
Historically, everyone used different local datums. For a long time, mapping on the peninsula used older standards, some even from the Japanese colonial era, like the Tokyo datum. But modern surveying, especially after 2000, shifted to a global standard called WGS-84. It's what GPS uses.
So it's like they were using two different rulers.
A perfect analogy. When the ROK military updated their maps in 2015, they were using older data that was based on a system that was close to WGS 84, but not quite. The UNC came along in 2016 with tech that was purely based on the modern global standard. That gap in time and technology created these small but systematic shifts all along the border.
And this isn't just a small problem in a few areas, it's widespread.
It's the norm, not the exception. Military officials estimate that the points where the two MDL standards don't align now outnumber the points where they do. We're talking about a discrepancy along something like 60% of the entire line.
60%.
60% of the border has these gaps, sometimes a few meters, sometimes much more, where the original 1953 marker is gone and the two modern maps are telling you two different things.
You know, this gets at the heart of the legal and operational challenges here. I want you to imagine you're a veteran officer, let's call him Colonel Park. 30 years he spent studying the 1953 Armistice. It's his Bible. And now he's staring at his monitor at two digital maps layered on top of each other, and they don't match.
He's got a legal vacuum right in front of him.
A phantom space. A few hundred square meters of forest that suddenly has no clear owner. I read a report where this exact confusion over which map to use caused a delay, and in that delay, North Korean engineers finished whatever they were doing and just walked away, unchallenged.
That is the operational nightmare. For Colonel Park, it's not a technical glitch. It's a choice between two terrible options. Follow the UN line and avoid an international incident, but maybe violate your own country's laws on territorial integrity. Or follow the ROK map, defend your soil, but risk a huge diplomatic crisis with the UN command, your main ally. A soldier shouldn't have to make that choice while looking through a scope.
And that scenario you just laid out, that's exactly the justification for the JCS's decision. They're trying to calculate that risk. Their goal is to somehow respect both of these authoritative standards at the same time. They can't just ignore the UNC line.
But why is the UNC line so important that it overrides defending what your own military map says is your territory?
Because the United Nations Command is the signatory to the 1953 Armistice. South Korea actually isn't. The signatories are the UNC, North Korea, and China.
Ah, that's the key.
It's the key. So if the ROK map says violation, but the UNC standard, which is the legal baseline for the whole armistice, says no violation, then taking military action could be seen as South Korea violating the armistice. And that would be a massive diplomatic problem. It would give North Korea all this leverage on the world stage, claiming the South is the aggressor.
So the South Korean military is basically making a trade-off. They're giving up a few dozen meters of disputed land to make sure they're in full legal compliance with the armistice and don't get into a fight with their main security partner.
That is the calculation, yes. But then you have to remember, North Korea doesn't even use either of those standards.
Right, you mentioned that.
They're on an old Soviet mapping system. They use the Russian GLONASS for satellite navigation. So you've got a three-way disagreement over where the line actually is. The whole DMZ is a cartographic minefield. And this new policy is South Korea's attempt to find the safest path through it.
Okay, so given this new guidance, this new caution, what's been the result on the ground? Has North Korea seen this restraint and matched it? Or have they seen it as an opportunity to push?
The results are very concerning. They really back up the fears of the critics. North Korean activity has surged since the policy was formalized. In just the 2 months after the September change, MDL incursions went way up.
How far up?
Well, this wasn't a huge issue earlier last year, but since September, there have been 13 crossings. And get this, 10 of those 13 happened in November alone.
10 incursions in a single month. That's a huge spike from the background noise. So how did the South Korean military respond to this under their new southernmost line and hostile intent rules?
The response was very restrained, which, is what the orders told them to do, but it raises big questions about deterrence. Of those 10 incursions in November, warning shots were not fired in 4 of them.
4 out of 10 times they just let it go.
Yes. And that's a dramatic change. Before this, since last year, the military had broadcast something like 2,400 warnings and fired warning shots 36 times in 21 different incidents. And it worked. They forced a retreat every single time. They had a nearly perfect record now. That record is being compromised.
So in those 4 cases, command decided either there was no hostile intent or the North Koreans were in that gray zone between the two map lines, so they held their fire.
That's the logical conclusion. So the policy is working if the goal is just to avoid a clash, but it's clearly coming at the expense of deterring the encroachment in the first place.
And that paradox, I imagine, has created a huge political backlash at home.
A massive one. The opposition, mainly the People Power Party, is pointing to this data, the rising incursions, the vanishing warning shots, as proof that the policy is a total failure for national defense.
What's the core of their argument? What are they saying specifically?
They're calling it an act of self-sabotage of national security. Representative Park Sung-hoon, he's a senior spokesperson for the party, he argued it's basically ceding territory by choice. He says the number of crossings proves the policy is sending, in his words, the wrong signal to Pyongyang.
The signal being that the border is now soft.
Exactly. That restraint is being read as weakness, as an invitation to probe. Another key figure, Representative Na Kyung-won, she questioned the whole logic of defaulting south whenever there's a doubt. And maybe more importantly, she accused the government of making this critical change without any public debate or parliamentary approval. She warned it weakens deterrence and just invites more risk.
It really boils down to that classic dilemma: vigilance versus de-escalation. For years, the policy has been to pursue dialogue but maintain readiness. Is the desire to avoid a provocation like the clashes we saw in the past around Mount Kumgang or in the Yellow Sea, is that now overriding the absolute need to defend the line?
That seems to be the strategic decision. The government emphasizes that reducing tension is the top priority, especially with North Korea's rhetoric being so aggressive. But the critics draw a very sharp line. They say avoiding a provocation is one thing, but conceding your own boundary and creating a zone of impunity, that's something else entirely.
So what should they have done instead, according to the critics?
The argument is that they should have first worked to resolve the 60% map discrepancy. They should have sat down with the UNC, established a single, unified, clear standard, and then written the operational rules based on that clear line.
Because the fear is that once you give up ground, you never get it back.
You set a dangerous precedent. The immediate win is you avoid a small, accidental firefight. But the long-term loss is you legitimize North Korea's encroachment. This policy, telling soldiers to wait and assess intent and use the southernmost map, it feels designed to make sure the South is never the one to accidentally start the next war. But in doing so, it might be letting the North accelerate its own project.
And that brings us to the bigger strategic picture. This policy change isn't happening in a vacuum. It's happening at the exact same time North Korea is going through this profound ideological shift.
That's the critical context. Since late 2023 and really kicking into high gear in January 2024, Kim Jong-un has dropped what you can only call an ideological bombshell. He has officially, formally abandoned the goal of peaceful unification.
The goal that's been the foundation of their state ideology for decades?
For 70 years. He has now declared the Republic of Korea a foreign country and, quote, the most hostile state to the DPRK. This is a complete break from his father and his grandfather. It's unprecedented.
And this isn't just rhetoric, it's a systemic change, right?
It is absolutely systemic. They are removing all references to unification from their society, tearing down monuments in Pyongyang, rewriting the constitution, shutting down the government agencies that dealt with inter-Korean affairs. They're trying to erase the very idea of Korean kinship from their media and schools. The moment Kim called it a relationship of two belligerent states, the whole game changed.
So if the new ideology is, we are two separate hostile countries, how does that play out physically along the MDL, which is supposed to be a temporary armistice line?
Since April of last year, North Korea has massively stepped up what it calls its borderline work. They are actively and very quickly turning that buffer zone into what looks like a permanent, hardened international border. They are making the ideology physically real on the ground.
What does that borderline work actually look like? What are they building?
It's industrial scale. Huge land clearing operations inside the DMZ, which is a violation of the Armistice. They're laying new minefields to harden the approaches, they're reinforcing tactical roads that lead right up to the line, and they're building these large permanent structures that look like anti-tank barriers in key places.
They're building a wall, essentially.
They're building a heavily fortified barrier. The tactical road fencing, for instance, has increased by about 10 kilometers in just the last year. We estimate the total length of this new fencing is somewhere between 50 and 60 kilometers now. These aren't temporary measures. They're designed to make the division permanent.
And all of this construction is happening while South Korean troops are under these new orders to show maximum restraint and use the most conservative interpretation of the border.
It creates an almost perfect situation for North Korea. They can operate with relative freedom in that gray zone we talked about. Their construction crews and patrols are pushing past the old lines, the ones South Korea used to defend with warning shots, and they're getting a much quieter response. Analysts see this as them physically cementing their two-state narrative.
I saw this haunting video recently taken from one of the observation decks. You can see the North Korean earth movers, the cranes, soldiers just methodically laying new fences. It reminded me of this story of an old man, Mr. Choi, who lives in one of those villages right near the MDL. For his whole life, he's lived with this idea that the barbed wire was temporary.
A long pause in one nation's history.
Exactly. But now he watches from his porch as they bring in giant concrete slabs and lay new minefields. It's not just a fence anymore. It's the physical proof of Kim Jong-un's hostile two-state idea being built right in front of him.
And because the South has effectively moved its own red line back,
the North has a green light to move in with concrete and steel and build their version of a permanent border. I've heard people say this construction is the final nail in the coffin for the dream of reunification.
And that perspective, Mr. Choi's perspective, is the profound long-term cost. This is the analysis of how South Korea's revised criteria is influencing North Korea's narrative. While the immediate goal might be to manage a crisis and not get baited into a fight, the psychological and territorial price is immense. Every concrete pillar the North sinks into that disputed ground makes the two-state reality harder and harder to ever undo.
The tactical piece of today is creating the strategic heartbreak of a permanent division tomorrow. And I take it this construction effort is far from over.
Not even close. Current estimates are that only about 20 to 30% of their planned borderline work is done. They're expected to pick it back up with even more intensity after their winter training cycle ends, probably around March 2026. This means we're looking at a prolonged period of high tension and more of these incursions.
So if the South Korean military knows this, and they're facing all this political criticism, what are they doing to actually solve the root problem, this 60% map mismatch? They can't just rely on the southernmost line policy forever, can they?
They can't. And they are trying to open up diplomatic channels. Seoul's defense ministry made a formal proposal last month to hold inter-Korean military talks. The stated goal was very specific. Let's sit down and figure out a way to clarify the MDL standard so we can reduce the risk of these accidental clashes.
They're given Kim Jong-un's new hostile state doctrine. I'm guessing Pyongyang's response was silence.
Complete silence, no formal response at all. From their perspective, why negotiate? Their unilateral actions on the ground, the digging, the building, are achieving their goal of permanent separation far more effectively than any talks would. So that diplomatic channel is closed for now.
Which leaves the United Nations Command. As the ultimate legal authority here, what's their take on all this?
The UNC's role is absolutely crucial. They are the enforcers of the 1953 Armistice. The current commander, U.S. General Xavier Brunson, he recently came out with a public statement, basically a caution against politicizing the DMZ. He was very clear that any changes have to stick strictly to the 1953 Armistice provisions. That has to be the governing framework.
Which puts Seoul in a tricky spot. If they adopt a standard that gives up ground that the UNC still technically recognizes as part of the buffer zone, they could be undermining the very agreement that protects them.
It's a very delicate balance, and you can see this southernmost line policy as a defensive legal move. It's an attempt to make sure that no action they take can ever be seen as violating the UNC's understanding of the line. They're choosing maximum legal and diplomatic safety, even if it comes at a territorial price.
So what are the actual concrete steps being taken to fix the map problem itself?
Well, the South Korean Defense Ministry knows this is the core issue. They have a plan to formally consult with the UNC next year, in 2026, with the specific goal of reconciling that 60% mismatch. The idea is to create a single, unified, authoritative standard. The big question will be whether the UNC is willing to adjust its 2016 line, or if the ROK military will have to formally adopt the UNC's line across the board.
So to sum this all up, we have the South Korean military trying to manage this impossible operational gap, this huge map mismatch, while facing a newly aggressive neighbor that's literally building a permanent border. The policy they chose is designed to prevent a war.
But it risks legitimizing the North's land grab and accelerating the death of the unification dream. That's the trade-off right there. This decision to default to the southernmost line, it's a reflection of this profound, immediate need to keep the peace when the very line on the map is obsolete. The short-term benefit is clear. You reduce accidental skirmishes. The JCS is successful in not being the aggressor in a gray zone fight.
But the strategic cost?
The strategic cost is monumental. It's a unilateral concession of soil. And, maybe more importantly, it allows North Korea to speed up the physical construction of its hostile two-state policy. They're using the map's uncertainty and the South's restraint to dig trenches and build walls unchallenged. Every one of those actions hardens the division, creating a new reality on the ground that will be almost impossible to reverse.
That strategic cost, that silent concession, is the lasting consequence of choosing tactical de-escalation over long-term strategic deterrence.